Good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. Before we start the proceedings, is there any particular reason why I found this on my desk? No? Okay. Madam Registrar, could you call the case, please?
Good morning, Your Honor. This is case IT-0475T, the prosecutor versus Goran Hadžić.
Thank you. May we have the appearances, please, starting with the prosecution?
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. For the prosecution, Douglas Stringer, Sarah Clanton, legal intern Anna Kostic, and case manager Tomalo Zhao.
Thank you. Mrs. Ivanovic for the defense.
Good morning, Your Honors. For the defense of Goran Hadžić, Zoran Živanović, and Christopher Gosnov, with Mrs. Negosel Smiljanić, case manager, and Mrs. Lian Aronchik, legal assistant. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Stringer, I've been told that you have a matter to raise.
Yes, Mr. President. There are a couple. We had been asked to give the prosecution response on a couple of the motions filed by the defense in the last couple of days related to adding exhibits to their 65 TUR list. And I wanted to just briefly tell the Chamber what our position is on that. We sent an email to the Chamber's legal officer last evening with regard to the first motion. The first motion relates to 49 or so proposed defense exhibits.
Mr. Stringer,
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I have a few things to say before we start, and rulings to make. And during that explanation, I will ask you to give your position on the different motions that are pending.
Very well,
Is
Your
that
Honor.
okay?
Apologies.
Thank you. Just one moment, please. There's a small problem with, technical problem with. Okay, it's solved. Before the defense commences its case, the Chamber has a few preliminary matters to address. On the 23rd of May 2014, the defense filed the corrigendum and addendum to Rule 65 TUR filings, whereby it seeks, inter alia, leave to add 47 documents to its exhibit list. The defense submits that the documents were inadvertently omitted from this exhibit list when it was originally filed on 13 May 2014, and that the documents have been disclosed to the prosecution. The prosecution did not make any submissions on the defense's request. The Chamber is satisfied that, taking into account the specific circumstances of the case, the fact that the error by the defense was corrected within 10 days of the submission of its Rule 65 TUR filings, and the lack of opposition to the request from the prosecution, that it is in the interest of justice to add the proposed documents. The defense request is hereby granted. On the 1st of July, the defense filed a motion to amend its Rule 65 TUR exhibit list with the addition of 214 documents. Of these, it clarified 49 documents are intended for use with Mr. Hadžić during his testimony, and hence requested that they be dealt with on an expedited basis. The prosecution indicated that it would respond orally this morning in court. Mr. Stringer?
Thank you, Mr. President. As to the 49, we sent a spreadsheet to the Chamber's legal officer last evening, setting out our position in respect of all of the ones that we have translations for. And largely not objecting, but there are some objections there. There were 26 documents for which we did not have the translation. Some number of translations has now been released by the defense, I saw yesterday afternoon. As to the remainder, those 26 for which we did not initially have translations, and as far as I know, we still don't have translations for all of them. We would like to have the opportunity, obviously, to review those and to inform the Chamber of our position on that Monday morning.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. The Chamber will issue its decision. Sorry, Mrs. Ivanovic, you want to reply?
We have the pending request for translation of these documents, Your Honor.
Thank you. The Chamber will issue its decision in due course. On the 2nd of July, the defense filed another motion for the amendment of its exhibit list, seeking the addition of a video documentary entitled Yugoslavia, the Avoidable War, which it intends to rely on during its opening statement. The prosecution was notified of the defense's intention to introduce the video along with a copy of the same on 14 May. The prosecution indicated it would also be able to respond orally to this motion in court today. Mr. Stringer, are you able to do so now?
Yes, Mr. President. No objection to the exhibit being added to the Defense 65 TUR list. I think the number is 1D03612. However, we would indeed object to its admission if indeed it's the defense intention to tender the video during the course of or following the opening statement. And of course, I don't know whether that's their intention or not. In any event, Mr. President, we've reviewed the video. We have some objections to it. It contains narrative statements of unidentified people who are giving their description of historical events, many of which fall outside the scope of this case and which could be classified as tu quoque, going back to the World War II events. Some of it as well relating to the events at Srebrenica. Some of it, and I think some viewers could view that as Srebrenica denial, in fact, in this video, but in any event, bears no relation to this case.
Mr. Stringer.
And so
Mr. Stringer.
Sorry, Your Honor.
Sorry, but for the moment we are only discussing addition to the 65 TUR list, not admission as evidence, of course.
Yes, Your Honor, I understand that. I just simply wanted to flag this because I'm not going to object during the opening because I don't want to interrupt my learned friend's submissions or his opening statement. However, we have reservations about its appropriateness for use in the opening, which we leave to the Chamber. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Mr. Ivanovic.
Doesn't work. Oh, yeah. Okay. Your Honors, we'll restrict the play of this video just to Croatia, to the part related to Croatia events. It is the first 47 minutes, not the whole video.
Thank you. The Chamber considers that the defense has failed to demonstrate due diligence in seeking to add this video to its 65-ter list. However, the Chamber notes that the video is an open source documentary and that the prosecution was notified of the defense's intention to rely upon it on 14 May. The Chamber accordingly will allow its addition to the Rule 65-ter exhibit list in the interest of justice. The Chamber will now move to commencing the defense phase of the case. At the pre-defense conference, the defense requested 30 to 45 minutes for Mr. Hadžić to make a statement pursuant to Rule 84 bis, immediately following the defense's opening statement, and confirmed that Mr. Hadžić will then also testify for 30 hours as a witness in his own defense pursuant to Rule 85C. The Chamber grants Mr. Hadžić leave to make a statement pursuant to Rule 84 bis for a maximum of 45 minutes. Mr. Hadžić, your statement should be restricted to matters relevant to the case, and bear in mind the dignity of these proceedings as well as the protection afforded to others by the tribunal. Mr. Hadžić, you have asked to exercise your right to testify in your own defense, during which time you will be sworn in as a witness. You are at liberty to decline to do so at any time before that. Do you confirm that you still wish to testify?
Potvrđujem da ću svedočiti u svoj odbrani.
I confirm that I will testify in my own defense.
The Chamber will now state the order of these proceedings. The defense will make its opening statement, following which Mr. Hadžić will make his statement pursuant to Rule 84 bis. Upon the conclusion of the statement, Mr. Hadžić will be sworn in as a witness and testify in chief for 30 hours as requested by the defense. The prosecution will then conduct its cross-examination, and the defense will have an opportunity to conduct a redirect following that. The judges may ask questions at any stage of these proceedings and will allow parties an opportunity to clarify or contextualize any issue arising from such questions. Mr. Zivanovic, you have the floor for your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honors. The defense will bring evidence to show that Goran Hadžić is neither individually responsible nor responsible as a superior for the prosecution's allegations of crimes against humanity and war crimes committed in Croatia between 25th of June 1991 and the end of 1993. Neither is Mr. Hadžić responsible for the permanent removal of Croat and other non-Serbs population from a large part of the territory of Republic of Croatia through the commission of crimes in violation of Articles 3 and 5 of the statute. The defense will present evidence that no joint criminal enterprise existed between Mr. Hadžić and the individuals listed in paragraph 10 of the prosecution's indictment. Mr. Hadžić entered into no agreement with them, and Mr. Hadžić did not possess the intent to permanently remove the non-Serb population from the territory of SBWS or the RSK. Indeed, he did not commit any crime alleged in the indictment and deserves acquittal on all counts. The defense has already challenged the evidence of some prosecution witnesses in its cross-examination. Your honors will now soon hear direct evidence that they lied to the court in the relevant parts of their testimony. The most drastic cases of dishonesty which the defense will rebut are GH 30, GH 03, GH 07, GH 10, GH 116, GH 044, GH 15, GH 16, GH 23, GH 24, GH 26, GH 124, GH 135, GH 154, GH 102, GH 027, GH 110, and GH 28. We shall also prove that some documents admitted into evidence are false. From the first day of trial, in its opening statement, prosecution attempted to present Mr. Hadžić as a violent man with sinister plans to harm non-Serbs, with the sinister plan to harm non-Serbs, sorry. As your honors get to know him personally in the coming weeks, your honors will see that he is, in fact, an ordinary man who loves his family. A former warehouse worker from a small village in Slavonia called Pačetin, which in 1991 had less than 1,000 inhabitants. He was man concerned about the direction of his country's rapidly changing politics, and who joined a local party and was propelled to his position by a series of events out of his control, and that would change his life forever. Your honors well know about his arrest in Plitvice on 31st of March 1991, and how those events put him in the national spotlight in ways he could not predict. Indeed, the defense will present evidence that Mr. Hadžić was often so out of his league, he was rarely privy to sensitive and confidential information. Even an ordinary man like Mr. Hadžić could see the writing on the wall as Yugoslavia began to crumble. Like many Serbs in Croatia, he felt frustrated, powerless, and indeed scared when he witnessed increasing violence directed at his fellow Serbs, discrimination against them in their workplaces, and harassment and terror. The rising tensions in the early 90s, displayed in media and around the country, reminded him of his grandfather, who in World War II was murdered by members of the fascist regime. His own father was a partisan who fought in the war. his memory was like that of the memories of so many Croatian Serbs, many of which had close relatives who suffered in decades past. These were not memories easily forgotten or dismissed by people. But Mr. Hadžić had no place to escape. Everything he had was in Pacetin. His home, his land, his job, his memories. He could not accept a future where he and his family would live in fear. He took action. He would learn later, sadly, that the destiny of the Serb people in the SBWS not to remain in Yugoslavia was already sealed. At the time, they still held on to hope that they could fight and sacrifice to preserve the status quo. In 1990, Mr. Hadžić joined a political party and got involved in the politics of his village. He hoped to change the system from within, legally and peacefully. The defense will bring witnesses who, as members of government, saw firsthand that Mr. Hadžić sought political compromise through negotiations. They will discuss how he became a member of the multi-ethnic SDP party, led by Croat politician Ivica Račan, in part because their political platform sought to keep Croatia within Yugoslavia. Mr. Hadžić entered into politics for that very reason, to preserve the status quo, so that he and his family would be safe. When the SDP leadership abandoned its pro-Yugoslav policy, however, Mr. Hadžić could no longer support them. He joined the SDS, the only political party that remained, which adopted the platform of preserving Yugoslavia, and indeed the only political party in Croatia that would protect the rights of Serbs and Croats alike. The defense will prove that Mr. Hadžić did his best to avoid the war and to maintain a working and functional relationship with the Croatian government. Your Honors will hear evidence from Mr. Hadžić himself and other witnesses about when Mr. Hadžić met with the late President of Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, and his other communications and negotiations with members of the government of Croatia, such as Josip Boljkovac and Slavko Degoricija. Your Honors will note that his efforts at communications and negotiations continued even after his arrest at Plitvice, even after he had been beaten by Croatian police in detention, even after he, of all people, may have had reason to change his approach. And yet, he remained on the path of peaceful resolution. This path was only blockaded when Croatia declared its independence. Your Honors heard in the prosecution's opening statement a one-sided understanding of the breakup of Yugoslavia. That opening statement skipped over crucial historical background and context of the events described in the indictment. Your Honors will therefore hear a number of witnesses who worked in the government ministry, as well as a historian, a legal expert and demographer, who will offer that context. In short, Your Honors, if you place yourselves in the shoes of the leaders of the former Yugoslavia in 1991, your understanding of the events would be that Croatia had seceded from the state and began an armed insurgency against the prevailing state and its army.
Interpreters note we do not have a text of the statement that is being read out.
Opening statement neglected.
Mrs. Ivanovic,
Sorry?
the interpreters note that they don't have a copy
Yes.
of your opening statement.
Unfortunately, I didn't provide it. That's correct.
Could someone of your team correct that?
Maybe you should make some pause and do it.
Okay. Mrs. Ivanovic, the registrar suggests that your case manager send it to her, and then it will be forwarded to the booth.
Yes, okay.
Okay, thanks.
You have hard copy, yes.
I think an attachment to the to an email would be easier. Pardon? You don't have internet. Okay. 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 The statement will be copied in a few minutes and then distributed to the interpreters. In the meantime, Mr. Zivanovic, you may continue, let's say, slowly, so that the interpreters have no problem with following what you're saying. Thank you.
Sorry. I repeat the last sentence. Your Honours will therefore hear a number of witnesses who worked in the government ministry, as well as historian, a legal expert and demographer, who will offer that context. In short, Your Honours, if you place yourselves in the shoes of the leaders of the former Yugoslavia in 1991, your understanding of the events would be that Croatia had seceded from the state and began an armed insurgency against the prevailing state and its army. Importantly, the prosecution's opening statement neglected a crucial distinction between Yugoslavia and Croatia in 1991. While in 1991, Yugoslavia was an internationally recognized state, a member of the United Nations, and otherwise a subject of international law, Croatia was just a territory in Yugoslavia. A territory's unilateral proclamation of the independence, whether based in a referendum or not, whether deriving from a decision of its assembly on 25th of June 1991, does not make it an independent state just like that. Of course, it could certainly be the first step towards independence, but not the final one, and it certainly would not take immediate effect either locally or under international law. Indeed, as your Honours will see in the video we will show you, analysts had predicted that Croatia's attempt to secede from Yugoslavia would likely end in violence. Yugoslavia, meanwhile, saw the referendum, the assembly decision, and the events that ensued as an act of secession in contravention of her constitution. From that point of view, such an act was an attack on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country as a whole. The federal authorities, including the GNA, the authorities of the federal units, other local authorities, and all citizens still, regardless of the upheaval, had the constitutional obligation to defend the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. Therefore, the engagement of the GNA from the very onset of the conflict was the legitimate act of the state in protection of its territorial integrity. The defense will demonstrate that the GNA was present in the parts of Croatia during the whole 1991 and first half of 1992 in order to carry out its duties under law and in and the effort to preserve a rapidly dissolving state. By virtue of GNA's presence in the areas designated as South Krajina, Southwestern Slavonia, and South SBWS, later known as RSK, during the armed conflict, signified that the military was in total control of the territory, its material resources, and its manpower. That authority would persist completely for all the events on the territory held by the GNA's units until its withdrawal in June 1992. The defense will provide the Chamber with a number of military orders, judicial acts of the military courts and their security organs, which will definitely prove the GNA's ongoing de facto authority in the region. Your honors have already seen a high-ranking GNA officer, Mr. General Života Panić, unabashedly claiming command over the volunteer units of Željko Ražnjatović-Arkan and Vojislav Šešelj. The prosecution's case and indictment glossed over Panić's incriminating admission and indeed avoided mention of all military men in the region who were actively commanding all units and exercising authority through 1991 and 1992. Those military men that the Chamber did hear conveniently shifted their responsibility to the local Serbs from Croatia. The prosecution also neglected that the proclaimed independence of Croatia, whether that alone created a new independent state or not, was not just a political act. The defense will demonstrate that as a result of the Serb population's vote, which declared to remain in Yugoslavia, the Serbs were exposed to a series of organized and systematic violence in order to neutralize or at least minimize their opposition. The elimination of Serbs from the Croatian constitution in the 1990s was followed with the massive dismissal of the Serbs from the Croatia state administration, primarily from the police, thus depriving Serbs of the protection of the state. Serbs felt intimidated as public rallies, widely promoted through media, broadcast any anti-Serb speeches and symbols, emblems and songs from the independent state of Croatia, which was deliberately reminiscent of the fascist regime under the patronage of Nazi Germany. Their use of these symbols reminded Serbs of the horrors that their parents and grandparents suffered during the time, simply because they were not Croatian or Catholics. Following these intimidating rallies came blastings, shooting, arson, and destruction of Serb property. Physical violence flourished, resulting in the disappearance, injuries, and killings of Serbs. It considerably reduced the presence and the political influence of Serbs in Croatia on the upcoming events. The defense will demonstrate that by 14 July 1991, that strategy brought 11,867 refugees to Serbia. In next 6 weeks, the number increased to 77,000. Contrary to evidence brought by the these refugees originated from Croatia because the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina had not yet begun. The most significant number of them arrived from Vukovar and the territory SBWS due to inadequate protection from violent attacks. In conditions of anarchy, violence, and chaos, only the federal authority had the power to prevent massive attacks and protect its citizens. The GNA was only federal force present in Croatia. Croatian forces, therefore, carried out a different attack strategy. They neutralized the GNA by encircling the commands, units, premises, and military personnel. The GNA's communication and supplies were cut off. The Croatian forces' efforts were indeed effective, as some of these units surrendered. Others resisted. These attacks were illegal, and the GNA had the right and duty both to resist and fight the attackers. The defense will offer evidence which will truly and accurately present the events described in the paragraphs 24 to 38 of the indictment. Therefore, the attacks on the GNA and its subordinate units in Croatia in 1990 and 1991 was an armed insurgency on the territory of an internationally recognized state. The military of the state, including all her authorities and citizens, had both legal and legitimate right to respond to those attacks with force. That response, legitimate in the eyes of both military commanders and civilian leaders at the time, negates the prosecution's position that the goal was to force the permanent removal of Croats and other non-Serbs. Your Honors will hear from Mr. Hadžić himself that he was not aware of any authority from the territory of the former Yugoslavia which stood behind such a policy. Your Honors will hear from the leaders of disparate factions that took advantage. Mr. Hadžić, in his capacity as president of SBWS government and president, did not support or assist position that would intentionally target non-Serbs. In any event, crimes were happening everywhere against anyone, regardless of ethnicity, in a way that the government could not fully control, despite its best efforts. The prosecution presumes that the instant in which a government is formed, it will immediately have all the resources, manpower, laws, and basic institutions necessary to make it legitimate, functioning, and capable of restoring peace and order. This proposition is naive and unrealistic. The supposition is similar to expecting government of Iraq to be perfectly functioning the day after Saddam Hussein was toppled. The reality was that Mr. Hadžić's newborn government lacked the most basic resources, including telephones, typewriters, and paper. let alone manpower, training, and supplies. The local civilian police were hobbled in the face of total chaos, conflict, and war. Your honors will see that in spite of that, Mr. Hadžić's government undertook numerous criminal investigations, generating many police and judicial documents which were brought against Serbs for crimes committed against Croats and other non-Serbs. These documents will definitely show that Mr. Hadžić and his government endeavored to enforce the law and punish the perpetrators of crimes, regardless of the ethnicity of the victim, as best they could, in a very, very bad situation. This evidence will directly undermine the prosecution's bold assertion that in the face of secession, dissolution of the state, armed conflict, and ensuing anarchy, Mr. Hadžić must have intended for neighbors to commit crimes against their neighbors as part of a broader plan. The defense will show the chamber a video entitled Yugoslavia, the Avoidable War. The video is in English with BCS subtitles. Unfortunately, we do not have a transcript at this time. This video contains the recollection of many international statesmen, scholars, and journalists who participated and followed the events in the former Yugoslavia and Croatia and produced their recollection to the relevant events. We'll play it for 47 minutes.
Night after night, television brought images of death and suffering from the war that engulfed Yugoslavia between 1991 and 1995. When the fighting stopped, NATO countries, particularly the United States, eagerly claimed credit for ending the war. The lesson learned, many said, was that there should be early intervention in ethnic conflicts, and preferably by NATO. But did the West prematurely take credit for ending a war it had helped create? Did misguided Western intervention actually transform a small brush fire in the Balkans into a major civil war?
I think that what the international community on the whole, the Europeans and the Americans and the United Nations have done, on the whole, made it sure that there was going to be a conflict.
The intelligence community was unanimous in saying that if we go ahead and recognize Bosnia, it will blow up.
Because there was no agreed branches and because everybody was armed, if you ruptured the old Yugoslavia by unilaterally declaring independence, in fact, seceding was a war of secession. Once you decided to secede, you had no hope that it could be done peacefully.
Early 1990 had brought a brief moment of hope and optimism to Europe as the Berlin Wall crumbled and the Cold War ground to a halt. A newly united Germany stood poised to unite the rest of Europe through its leadership of the European Community, a friendly but powerful rival to the United States. But the promise of European unity was short-lived. Just 2 years later, much of Yugoslavia was in flames. A small war in the Slovenian Republic led to larger, more bloody conflicts in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Moreover, European nations, the United States, and Middle Eastern states were backing different factions in these outbreaks of civil war. Publicly, Western diplomats blamed irresponsible ethnic leaders of the different Yugoslav republics for the bloodshed, including Milan Kucan of Slovenia, Franjo Tudjman of Croatia, and especially Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia. There was certainly no innocence among the warring parties. Privately, however, European Community envoy Lord Carrington and UN mediator Cyrus Vance were furious at Germany's foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher. Vance would later call the conflict Mr. Genscher's War because of Germany's push to recognize separatists in Slovenia and Croatia.
Vance argued that recognition would take away the diplomatic leverage that he had to try to bring the conflict in Croatia to an end and could possibly result in Bosnia blowing up.
The former German foreign minister claimed that his government did not support the breakup of Yugoslavia until fighting began.
We held a strong position for the unity of Yugoslavia, as I said, but we saw that the will to keep it together vanished more and more under the pressure of military events.
In fact, however, since the 1960s, Germany's intelligence arm, the BND, was deeply involved in the training of Croatian separatists, led by the pro-Nazi Ustashi who fled to Germany after World War II and participated in a number of terrorist actions against embassies and the government of Yugoslav communist leader Josip Broz Tito.
In the early 60s, the BND decided to cooperate fully with the Ustasha. This became plain to see after the so-called Croat Spring in the beginning of the 70s. After Tito's death, they accelerated their efforts, together with the Ustasha, in order to disintegrate Yugoslavia into several smaller states.
Germany's crucial role in supporting Croatian separatists is confirmed by Anton Duhacek, the former director of Yugoslav counterintelligence, who was himself a Croat.
The Germans wanted an absolute and complete subordination of Croatian intelligence that would carry out all that the Germans wanted. And the Germans promised that this would be in the interest of the future independent, free Croatia.
On the surface, Yugoslavia seemed better off than its East European neighbors in the 1970s and 80s. The U.S. considered its independent communist leader, Josip Broz Tito, an asset in the Cold War with Moscow. Yugoslavia's economy was propped up with Western loans even after Tito's death in 1980. The carefully staged 1984 Olympics in Sarajevo offered the world the impression of a peaceful, multi-ethnic country working together. Veteran observers, however, could see trouble below the surface.
I think the first hint I got of a violent breakup was when I made a tour of all of the republics in 1983, and I heard a lot of sort of separatist sentiments in several of the republics, especially Slovenia and Croatia, but not only. And some very threatening remarks were made in the course of my conversations about what we would do to them and so on.
By themselves, neither Slovenia nor Croatia had the diplomatic or military power to actually separate, to challenge Yugoslavia's federal army, which was the fourth largest in Europe. But Germany provided not only diplomatic support, but also weapons, even after an international arms embargo.
And I wrote a story about it, which was called The Blockade's a Joke. And so I went and started checking the ports, like Split and the ports along the Dalmatian coast. And as best I could, checking the stuff that was coming across the borders. And there was no limitation.
We saw a Croatian MiG-21 shot down in the Krajina, which the Croatians said came from former Yugoslav Air Force stocks. In fact, it was clearly from East German Air Force stocks. It had the East German radar warning receivers on board. So we know that these weapons are coming from the former East German stocks, so that they're, if you like, slightly disguised in the sense that they don't look like West German weapons, but they are coming from West Germany, obviously with the West German government's blessing. There can be no other way in which heavy weapons can be supplied like this.
While separatist forces were being armed, Germany was, at the same time, warning the Yugoslav government of Ante Marković not to use force against separatists. Ante Marković, who was himself a Croatian, presided over a divided government which was unable to stand up to German pressure or rally his government for the challenges ahead.
He never lined up, coalition support. He always flew solo. So, he could be welcomed in the White House, and was, but he didn't have any backing at home. So, in that sense, he was a real failure, and a disastrous one in that he preserved the fiction that Yugoslavia was holding together.
The Yugoslav Federal Army, which held the country together, now became a target for those who wanted to break it apart. At a Croatian separatist rally in Split in May of 1991, demonstrators strangled a young soldier of the Federal Army and then tossed his dead body onto the street. This and similar events seem to bear out predictions by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency.
The CIA said in 1990, October, that Yugoslavia faced breakup, probably violent, as early as 6 months from the time of the report. And nobody paid any attention to it in the higher echelons of government.
By June of 1991, however, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker decided to make one attempt to prevent a disaster. He flew to Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, to confront leaders of the 6 republics.
He said, don't any of you take steps that are not agreed on by the others.
However, Milan Kucan and Franjo Tudjman, leaders of the Slovenian and Croatian republics, were confident that they could ignore the U.S. Secretary of State. They declared their independence just days later, on June 25th, because they could count on the support of German Foreign Minister Genscher and Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock. The cycle of violence which would destroy Yugoslavia began when Slovene President Milan Kucan ordered his troops to seize customs posts on the Yugoslav borders with Austria and Italy, and the Slovene capital of Ljubljana. Yugoslav flags were taken down and replaced with Slovenian flags.
And the Slovenes thought they had a right to take down those flags. The end of an internationally recognized frontier. And I don't think that for a moment Belgrade expected there would be violent resistance.
To avoid violence, Yugoslav Army General Andrija Rašeta had phoned Milan Kucan privately to let him know that many Yugoslav Army troops responding to this challenge of federal authority were not even carrying live ammunition.
But in fact, the Slovenes had prepared themselves. They were getting a lot of encouragement from across the way, from Vienna and from the Germans too. And they foresaw that they could make a very big international case by having what they called a war of independence. It was nothing of the sort.
German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher flew to the Austrian border with Yugoslavia to join President Kucan and warned the Federal Army against efforts to maintain control of federal borders. Kucan ordered his forces to fire on Yugoslav Army troops, including those who carried no live ammunition. Faced with international opposition led by Germany, Yugoslav President Marković ordered the Federal Army to withdraw from Slovenia without a serious attempt to counter separatist forces. Slovene leaders conducted a masterful public relations effort. Foreign reporters were kept occupied in an underground press center with briefings that suggested that Slovene forces had defeated the 4th largest army in Europe. Journalists in the press center routinely reported as news fanciful briefings from Slovene officials on various battles, including some that had never happened.
What was going on in Slovenia, where the Slovenians declared independence and set up customs posts on the road, tended to be seen and portrayed on television as the Yugoslav army acting aggressively against Slovenia as opposed to the Slovenians declaring independence.
The manipulation of the foreign press corps set the tone for new wars of secession in Croatia and Bosnia. Repeatedly, the JNA was described as an occupying force dominated by Serbs. The reality was different, however. The Army's Chief of Staff, Veljko Kadijević, was half Croatian, half Serb, Air Force Chief Zvonko Jurjevic was Croatian, and the commander of the Navy, Stane Brovec, was Slovenian.
And the Federal Army had held Yugoslavia together under Tito without creating any protests about human rights. Tito insisted on an ethnic balance, and in the localities it was composed of the people of that area. It was absurd to call it an army of occupation. And we, the West, should have recognized it until there was an agreed arrangement for a dissolution of a state which had been Yugoslavia and which might take years or decades or perhaps be impossible. Until then, it had to be recognized these were the internationally recognized frontiers.
If German and Austrian leaders still believed that Slovenia and Croatia could be separated from Yugoslavia without a wider war, the Americans strongly believed otherwise.
Because we said, if Yugoslavia does not break up peacefully, there's going to be one hell of a civil war. It nevertheless broke up non-peacefully. It broke up through the unilateral declaration of independence by Slovenia and Croatia and the seizing by these two countries, republics, of their border posts, which was an act of force and which was an act that was in violation of the Helsinki principles. But the European powers and the United States ultimately recognized Slovenia and then Croatia and then Bosnia as independent countries as and admitted them to the United Nations. The real problem was that there was a unilateral declaration of independence and a use of force to gain that independence rather than a peaceful negotiation of independence, which is the way it should have happened.
While most of Europe, including England, France, and Russia, opposed the breakup of Yugoslavia, only the Americans were strong enough to oppose Germany. In a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, however, the Americans decided to back away from this challenge. George Kenney, who would later resign in protest over policy, was running the U.S. State Department's Yugoslavia desk at the time.
Our marching orders were to keep the U.S. out, to avoid taking any responsibility for a solution to the conflict. The analysts could see that the problem would get a lot worse. They also saw that the Europeans weren't going to be able to handle it.
Historically, the United States had supported a multi-ethnic Yugoslavia over a 70-year period to stabilize the region and serve as a barrier to German expansion. In reality, Yugoslavia, a union of South Slavic peoples, would never have come together in 1918 without American support from U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. For centuries, the region had been colonized by Austro-Hungary and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The Austrians, under the Habsburg monarchy, used a policy of divide and rule to maintain control, keeping the Slovenes, Croatians, Serbs, and Muslims at each other's throats, instead of uniting them in their common interests.
The Habsburg Empire kept going and held down a large part of what we came to call Yugoslavia. There was no possibility of a Slav get-together until after the First World War, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the peoples came together and decided to unite.
With American support, Yugoslavia was founded in 1918 and survived German attempts to divide it up during World War II. When Yugoslavia's communist leader Josip Broz Tito broke away from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in 1948, the U.S. stepped in with military assistance as well as international loans to prop up a buffer state between the West and the communist-dominated Warsaw Pact. As the Cold War came to an end, however, Washington declared a new world order which emphasized economic competition rather than anti-communism.
So once that containment of the Soviet Union began to disappear as a need with the decline after mid-80s, Gorbachev's economic reforms, the NATO Warsaw Pact talks about reducing arms and force buildup, all of that led to Yugoslavia being essentially irrelevant in its defense posture. And by early 1989, the Americans were really quite explicit. The new ambassador to Yugoslavia from the United States informed the Yugoslav government that the Yugoslav position was no longer needed, that it was no longer, Yugoslavia was no longer strategically important to the United States and Western defense.
Yugoslavia had become expendable. International loans were called in, causing triple-digit inflation. The federal government was forced to require austerity measures from the different republics.
Particularly those requirements led Slovenia as a republic and eventually other republics to rebel against what was being called economic reform in the constitutional level.
Any American efforts to preserve Yugoslavia would also put Washington on a collision course with Germany when German leaders were enjoying their first taste of real political power since World War II. Moreover, U.S. President George Bush had declared a special relationship with Germany, the kind America used to have with England.
The United States thought that Germany would have to be largely responsible for the incorporation of Eastern Europe and Central Europe into the West, because Germany had a national interest, it was its neighbor, its periphery, and it was financially the most powerful country in Europe and had the resources to do it.
In the post-Cold War period, Germany wanted, once again, the evidence is very clear, to recolonize Yugoslavia, to recolonize the Balkans. And the United States tied itself to German policy through its need of German power and influence in stabilizing Eastern Europe, Western Europe, through the exercise of dominion via the European Community, now the European Union, and potentially, eventually, in the former lands, in the lands of the former Soviet Union. The problem was that there was one very important country standing in the way of this, and that was Yugoslavia.
While citizens of Croatia were initially divided over whether to remain in Yugoslavia, the separatists were led by the most extreme elements, remnants of the pro-Nazi Ustashi. As the New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal would write, in World War II, Hitler had no executioners more willing, no ally more passionate than the fascists of Croatia. They are returning from 50 years ago from what should have been their eternal grave, the defeat of Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler considered Yugoslavia to be an artificial creation of the hated Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I. To break it up, he set up a puppet state, an enlarged Croatia, which also included Bosnia-Herzegovina. As its leader, he appointed the fanatical Croat Ustashi Ante Pavelić. Pavelić had helped plot the assassination of King Alexander, Yugoslavia's first constitutional monarch, in Marseille, France in 1934.
And it was the Germans, the German Nazis, who picked out this dreadful Ustashi leader who had made quite clear that he favored Hitler's solution to be applied, which his final solution for the Jews he wanted to apply to the Serbs. He made no secret of it.
Simon Wiesenthal, who tracked Ustashi fugitives for decades, along with other Nazi war criminals, told an interviewer,
I must admit I am obsessed by the criminal character of the independent state of Croatia. Even the Germans were appalled by the crimes committed in it.
How many men, women, and children died there? Hitler's special envoy to the Balkans, Hermann Neubacher, wrote, leaders of the Ustashi boast that they have slaughtered 1 million Orthodox Serbs. On the basis of official German reports, I estimate the number to be 750,000. Most of these Serbian civilians perished in the notorious Croatian death camp Jasenovac, which straddled the Sava River between Croatia and Bosnia. The extermination of Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies in Sarajevo was the task of top Muslim leaders who, with few exceptions, collaborated with Hitler and the Croatians.
There was in occupied Bosnia, also under German patronage, a strong Muslim wing which was very anti-Western. It was represented internationally by the Mufti of Jerusalem. You heard of his viciously anti-Western views, and he was brought to Sarajevo and mobbed by enthusiastic crowds.
After the war ended, Croatia and Bosnia were never denazified. Not only were there no apologies to the Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies, but attitudes remained frozen under the surface of Tito's official policy of socialist fraternity amongst peoples. Following the death of Yugoslavia's longtime leader, Tito, in 1980, right-wing émigré organizations took out an advertisement on the opinion page of the New York Times, stating that Yugoslavia would not survive, and offering a map which included all of Bosnia as part of Croatia. It was a map nearly identical to the Nazi-created independent state of Croatia. By 1990, as communism was collapsing in Eastern Europe, Croatian separatists pinned their hopes on a former communist general named Franjo Tuđman, who had been jailed for excessive nationalism by Tito in the 1970s.
You know, I met him very soon after he came out of communist jail, while Tito was still alive. He had then championed the racialist nationalist form of nationalism. And when he came out of prison, instead of doing what you would think a dissident would do and say, to hell with the communists, he said, oh, well, it has nothing to do with the regime. It's those horrible Serbs who are oppressing us, and the Serbs are responsible for everything, and the Serbs are guilty, and the Serbs have done it all.
Tuđman received important help from outside of Croatia in his rise to power.
The German Secret Service was enormously active in Croatia and in all of Yugoslavia, trying in the 80s to build bridges between what were called the national communists, Stipe Mesić, Franjo Tuđman, in Yugoslavia, and the Ustasha revanchist organizations which lived in the diaspora of Croatia, that is to say, all of the people of weight and influence who had fled the former Nazi puppet state in 1945.
Tuđman found it useful to come to terms with them, and because he was running on this xenophobic platform, there was really no difficulty about it. What was difficult was when he was trying to sell his cause in the West, and he managed to, partly because he had a very good lobby, very effective and much more effective than the Serbian lobby, and partly because he covered up his intentions.
Tuđman often embarrassed his most important supporters, such as German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. For instance, Tuđman had written a book minimizing the crimes of the Ustashi and claiming that the Holocaust was greatly exaggerated. "Thank God my wife is neither a Serb nor a Jew," he told one interviewer. For the national flag, Tuđman chose a replica of the checkerboard emblem that flew over the Croatian death camps of World War II, where Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies were exterminated. Tuđman's anti-Semitic views were covered beneath rhetoric acceptable to the West. With the help of Reuter and Finn, a high-powered American public relations firm, the New York Times found space for General Tuđman's new and misleading image on its opinion page. In the article, Tuđman promised that there would be no purges against the Serbian population in Croatia if it separated from Yugoslavia.
Tuđman declared that Croatia was for the Croats. That was his slogan, a racialist slogan. Croatia for the Croats, with the implication people who weren't Croats, and there was a very substantial Serb and Yugoslav mixed variety, didn't feel that they were in fact second-class citizens, and he recognized them as such.
A full 6 months before fighting broke out, Serbs were purged from positions in government, news organizations, and the police. Their homes were dynamited in cities such as Zagreb, Zadar, and Dubrovnik. For the first time since World War II, Serbs in eastern Croatia began to flee across the Danube River.
Serbs working in Croatian cities were required to sign loyalty oaths. Those who did not sign were fired. Those who did sign were fired later. Serb homes, apartments, and businesses were attacked.
Predsjednik Republike Hrvatske, gospodin Franjo Tuđman, dao nam je odobrenje da po prvi put formiramo nenaoružane odrede civilne zaštite Hrvatske demokratske zajednice.
Any doubt that Tuđman himself issued orders for the expulsion of Serbs in Croatia was removed by Tomislav Merčep, a senior member of Tuđman's ruling party, the HDZ. Merčep would later be identified by Croatian police reports as one of 2 Croatian leaders who directed death squads that murdered hundreds of Serbian civilians in eastern Slavonia around Vukovar and Osijek in the fall of 1991. he received little press coverage in the West, but Merčep was, in many ways, the spark that set the fire of war in Slavonia, a disputed region of Croatia where the Yugoslav War began. Merčep's co-leader of the Croatian death squads was Branimir Glavaš of Osijek. Unlike more discreet members of the ruling HDZ party, Glavaš made no secret of his identification with the World War II Croatian Ustaši as he welcomed returning Croatian prisoners of war. While some French intellectuals were hailing Croatia as part of the new Europe, old and familiar forces were at work. Osijek became a magnet for neo-fascist groups fighting with Glavaš. They included British skinheads, German and Austrian neo-fascists, and followers of the French extremist Jean-Marie Le Pen.
C'est comme ça que l'on bâtit l'Europe nationaliste.
Et vous y allez directement après, demain?
Oui, demain nous partons pour Zagreb pour prendre des ordres à l'état-major, mais pas de l'armée croate régulière. Nous allons avec la force de défense croate qui dépend du parti du droit croate, et donc nous partirons quelque part sur le front en Slavonie, je suppose.
The United States, which soon adopted Germany's approach to the Balkans, ignored recent history and offered a simple explanation for the fighting which broke out in the predominantly Serbian region of Croatia, which was known as the Krajina. Assistant Secretary of State Richard Holbrooke, who spent the early years of the Yugoslav War as the American ambassador to Germany, represented what became the official American view.
The Serbs started this war. The Serbs are the original cause of the war.
Those who tried to prevent the war saw it differently.
The Serbs in Croatia, and indeed outside Croatia, had a very vivid memory of what happened in 1941-42, when Hitler declared Croatia as an independent puppet state, if you like, and the horrors that went on there and the murders of the Serbs were still very, I mean, a very large number of Serbs were murdered at that time. I mean, hundreds of thousands. And I think it was very understandable that when Croatia declared its independence and promulgated a new constitution without any safeguard for the 600,000 Serbs who still lived in Croatia, the Serbs were very perturbed about this.
From the beginning, the Serbs were blamed, and they were partly blamed out of ignorance because nobody bothered to look back at the history, to put it within its historical context, and to see why the Serbs who lived in Krajina and the Serbs who lived in the area that is called Bosnia-Herzegovina, why, because of their historical experiences, were so hostile to being under Zagreb or under Muslim Sarajevo rule.
In World War II, Serbs offered the first serious resistance to Nazi Germany on the mainland of Europe. Later in the war, the Serbian royalists, sometimes known as the Chetniks, organized the largest rescue of downed American pilots behind enemy lines. But U.S. relations with the Serbs deteriorated greatly by 1989, symbolized by the stormy relationship between Slobodan Milosevic, the new leader of Serbia, and Warren Zimmerman, the new U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia.
I think Warren came out of Vienna from his last post as an ambassador dealing mainly with human rights, and his first action as ambassador was to go to Kosovo and embrace the Kosovo separatist leaders. And this automatically offended the relatively new Serbian leadership under Slobodan Milosevic.
By the late 1980s, ethnic unrest in Kosovo had already set the stage for the breakup of Yugoslavia. For Serbs who first inhabited the area in the 7th century AD, Kosovo was the cradle of their civilization, their Jerusalem, and home to their most revered monasteries.
A bit of history, unfortunately, is required here. The Albanians pushed Serbs out in the 19th century. The Serbs started pushing Albanians out around 1904. The Albanians surged back in World War II under Italian protection and pushed Serbs out.
When the war ended, however, Marshal Tito decided to keep the Serbian refugees from returning to their homes in Kosovo. As a result, Serbs lost their majority in the province.
Tito is very guilty of that particular drama of Kosovo. He made it much harder to solve, in fact, almost impossible.
To keep a restive Albanian population within the Yugoslav Federation, Tito's 1974 constitution gave Kosovo autonomy as a province of Serbia. However, the autonomy was badly abused by Tito's Albanian communist cadres, who permitted a campaign of violence to drive out the remaining Serbian population.
Life was made extremely difficult for the Serb minority, and it was here that the Kosovos began to push to have a pure, all Albanian, meaning racially pure, Kosovo in the areas where there were very few Serbs anyhow. They were pushing them out. And the Serbs used the word that it was ethnic cleansing, and that's what it was.
Homes of Serbs were appropriated by Albanians. Orthodox Christian cemeteries and monasteries were desecrated. By the late 1980s, the Serbian population of Kosovo had gone from 50% at the start of World War II to just 10%. At this time, Slobodan Milosevic emerged as the voice of Serbian discontent over Kosovo. Seeking to consolidate his political base in his own republic, Milosevic also spoke for Serbian minorities living in Croatia and Bosnia who feared the emergence of hostile separatist regimes. A lifelong political opportunist, Milosevic was willing to provide limited military support to the Serbs of the Krajina as long as it suited his own agenda. The Serbian leader's maneuvers, however, deepened the chaos that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia.
I think he is enormously to blame for his treatment of Western powers from the beginning of 1991. He regarded them as the enemy and he would not talk to them.
While Serbia's president shunned meetings with the American ambassador, separatist leaders were receiving a sympathetic ear from Warren Zimmerman. The American ambassador and his boss, Assistant Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, largely ignored the provocations of separatists in Slovenia and Croatia, who were backed by Germany and focused solely on the Serbs.
The two of them adopted a stance that was, from day one, blaming the Serbs for just about everything. The Serbs were the target of all of the actions of the United States of America from the beginning.
So did American news organizations, whose foreign correspondents relied heavily on the U.S. Embassy for their reporting. Yet the obsessive focus of the press with Milosevic served to divert attention from the role of Western powers in making an avoidable war inevitable. While some Western leaders called Milosevic an architect of the conflict, the first shots of the war had been fired by armed separatists in Slovenia and Croatia, strongly supported by Germany. In hope of heading off disaster, the European community organized a constitutional conference in 1991, led by respected British diplomat Lord Peter Carrington, to find a compromise between those who wanted to separate from Yugoslavia and those who wished to keep it together. The problem was that administrative borders, or internal frontiers, devised by Tito in 1943, left 1/3 of the Serbian population out of Serbia, mostly in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia.
These frontiers were drawn in a very secretive and very, in my view, very irresponsible way by Tito's inner cabinet while the war was still going on. And they were never subject to a public debate or discussion. They were never endorsed.
The idea of giving each republic substantial economic and political autonomy meant that each was a kind of hierarchy of the party, and then there was you had, in order to keep the country together, you had to balance out these political leaders. And Tito was very skillful in playing one off against the other, or in some cases of playing them against their population. It was the substitute for democracy in the way that we know it, but it was also considered by many of his supporters throughout the population as necessary because To their view, democracy led to national, or as we call them, ethnic parties, and that would then break up the country and lead to civil war again.
As Yugoslavia slid toward civil war in 1991, 2 referendums were held on the same day in Croatia. Croatians voted overwhelmingly to separate from Yugoslavia, while ethnic Serbs, particularly those from the Krajina region, voted by a similar margin to remain within Yugoslavia. A compromise favored by European community negotiators would have permitted Croatia to leave the Yugoslav Federation, but would have permitted the regions where Serbs formed a majority to remain in Yugoslavia or to gain substantial autonomy. Serbs who lived in an independent Croatia would be guaranteed full citizenship and human rights protections. In the capital city of Zagreb, Croatian President Tudjman seemed reluctantly prepared to accept this compromise, which would have prevented a major military conflict. Germany, however, announced it would recognize both Slovenia and Croatia within Tito's administrative borders before the end of 1991. There would be no compromise. The Serbs were bitter that the first act of a newly united Germany would be to divide the Serbs of Yugoslavia into at least 3 separate countries. A crucial opportunity to divide Yugoslavia by peaceful means was now threatened by Germany's action.
It broke up the Constitutional Conference because once you gave 2 out of the 6 republics their independence, those 2 had no further interest in the Constitutional Conference. You had to ask the other republics whether they wanted their independence, which meant you had to ask Bosnia, and it was perfectly plain that Bosnia, there was going to be a civil war in Bosnia if you did do that.
UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar sent a strong letter to German leaders, warning that recognition would be a disaster. Germany and Austria's own ambassadors in Belgrade privately warned against recognition of Croatia.
The Germans risked being isolated, but the pressure from Kohl's party and from the huge lobby of Croat lobby in the southern parts of Germany, and Bavaria particularly, was such that it was difficult for Genscher to go on postponing the support.
By the time the war started, the German public had already been prepared by the repeated attacks on the Serbs in an influential German newspaper in Frankfurt. The strident commentary of Johann Georg Reismüller, which favored Croatia and reviled the Serbs, any Serbs, all Serbs, reminded Peter Handke of the way Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels once characterized the Jewish race.
It was the German press, in the form par excellence of the right-wing Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and its journalists that fundamentally influenced German policy.
German support for Croatian separatists received an unusual tribute, a musical thank you on Croatian state television.
Danke Deutschland, meine Seele brennt. Danke Deutschland für das liebe Schenk.
Serbian television broadcast Croatia's musical thank you, interspersed with World War II footage of cheering Croatian crowds in Zagreb welcoming Hitler's troops. All sides used propaganda, but Serbian propaganda was aimed at the Serbian population to bolster Milosevic's power base. By contrast, Croatian propaganda was designed to win international support. With the help of public relations firm Ruder and Finn, Croatia successfully used the media to manipulate a larger audience, particularly Germany and the US, to gain support for its separatist agenda. This was particularly evident in the reporting of the war around the resort town of Dubrovnik, a favorite vacation spot for German tourists. Working through its Washington PR firm, the Croatian government managed to convince much of the world that Dubrovnik was being destroyed by the Serbs in unprovoked attacks which lasted for months during the fall of 1991.
The public has been led to believe that the Federal Army attack on Dubrovnik was not precipitated by anything but sheer malice. However, on August 25th of 1991, Croatian forces attacked a base in the Bay of Kotor, on the Bay of Kotor, and they were repulsed with heavy losses.
Yugoslav troops based in Montenegro then fought their way up the coast, confronting Croatian forces near Dubrovnik.
targets outside the old city were hit, consisting mostly of hotels which had been taken over as barracks and spotter points by Croatian forces, who also put refugees in the lower stories of their own barracks and spotter facilities.
It was obvious that the Croats were using the old town as a defensive wall. They were firing from behind hospitals. They had a mortar position next to our hotel. The final straw for me was when there was this incredible bombardment in our hotel basement. Bang, 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 bang. The worst we had ever heard. And I was furious, and everyone else was panicking. And I said to the manager who was down there with us, I said, I wish you would tell that chap with the heavy machine gun in the floor above to stop firing at the Serbs, because they're going to fire back.
Contrary to news reports, there was little damage to the historic old city.
Yes, it has been reported some 15,000 shells rained on the old city of Dubrovnik. I counted 15 mortar hits on the main street. The Yugoslav Federal Army could have destroyed the old city of Dubrovnik in 2 hours. It is not destroyed.
Washington Post reporter Peter Maas, who visited the old city several months after the fighting stopped, found Dubrovnik in what he described as nearly pristine condition.
There are many people who go to these scenes of mayhem and adventure who don't know where they are, who don't know the languages, cannot really communicate with the people, and who take press handouts from the local authorities. So there is certainly an orchestrated effort on the part of the Croatian and the Slovenian, Austrian, and German media to portray the Serbs as a bunch of howling, Byzantine, uncivilized barbarians.
The facts on the ground, however, mattered little after first impressions had been made. Rather than admit that they had made a mistake, influential columnists on both sides of the Atlantic continued to write that Dubrovnik had been destroyed. Public opinion was tilted against the Serbs and towards Croatia's political goal, recognition as an independent state. These impressions helped strengthen Germany's resolve to lead a reluctant European community to recognize the separatist republics and thereby dismantle Yugoslavia. To overcome British opposition to recognizing Croatia, German Prime Minister Helmut Kohl offered British leader John Major a deal which left Britain free to disregard or opt out of the social provisions of the 1991 treaty creating a unified Europe, which was being hotly debated in the British Parliament. This helped John Major politically at home, but Bosnia would pay a high price. The French, who needed German help to stabilize France's currency, also dropped their opposition to recognizing the separatist republics. The United States, the only power strong enough to oppose Germany, began to waver. Deputy Secretary of State Lorenz Eagleberger, who had once served as U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia and spoke Serbo-Croat, knew well the dangers of a wider war if recognition were extended before a settlement had been reached between the different ethnic groups.
I think the major lesson here is that when you get involved in something like this with 1,000 years of history underlying it all, you need to understand that once the dam breaks, the viciousness can be pretty awful on all sides.
In the end, here also, peace would be sacrificed for domestic politics. There was an American election coming up.
When we finally went ahead and recognized, one of the reasons we did so was because it had become a major domestic political issue for us here. We have particularly a large Croatian American community, and Mr. Bush lost most of them in the election that he lost, because they were unhappy with our having delayed as long as we did in recognizing Croatia.
While German actions encouraged the armed secession of Slovenia and Croatia, it was U.S. diplomacy, particularly through Ambassador Warren Zimmerman, which helped light the spark for a war in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Your Honor, I see the clock, and it might be time for the break.
How long is your video going on?
It's finished.
It's finished now?
It's finished now.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.